Hello English learners and story enthusiasts. Welcome to Story-Driven English, where we transform complex international events into captivating narratives that improve your language skills while entertaining your mind. What if I told you that in 2025, the world nearly witnessed a modern-day invasion over one of humanity's greatest engineering marvels? A single statement by a powerful president set off a diplomatic firestorm that threatened to redraw the map of the Americas and reshape global trade forever. Today, we're diving into the Panama Canal chess game, a tale of two leaders, a story where billion-dollar deals, military strategies, and the pride of nations collide over control of the narrow waterway that connects two oceans. You'll witness boardroom intrigue, presidential showdowns, and backroom diplomacy as a small Central American nation stands up to the world's superpower. But this isn't just any story. As you journey through this diplomatic drama, you'll naturally absorb over 100 sophisticated English terms and expressions used in international relations, business, and politics, vocabulary that would take weeks to memorize through traditional methods, but will flow effortlessly into your mind through our storytelling approach. By the end of this journey, you'll not only understand how modern geopolitics actually works behind the headlines, but you'll also find yourself using phrases like diplomatic maneuvers, sovereignty disputes, and geopolitical calculations in your own English conversations. So settle in for a tale of power, pride, and the changing global order. And if you find yourself captivated by this approach to learning English through immersive storytelling, consider joining our growing community by subscribing to Story-Driven English. Each story we share is carefully crafted to expand your vocabulary while keeping you on the edge of your seat. Now, let's travel to Washington, D.C., where President Donald Trump is about to make an announcement that will send shockwaves through international waters. The Panama Canal chess game, a tale of two leaders. Chapter 1. The Trump Declaration. On a chilly March morning in 2025, the grand chambers of the United States Congress were filled with anticipation. President Donald Trump, known for his unpredictability and flair for dramatic pronouncements, stood confidently at the podium. His distinctive voice echoed through the hall as members of Congress, some nodding in approval, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats, listened attentively. "My administration will be reclaiming the Panama Canal," Trump declared with characteristic certainty, pausing for effect as murmurs rippled through the audience. "And we've already started doing it." The statement hung in the air like a storm cloud. In the warmth of his Mar-a-Lago residence the previous month, Trump had already hinted at this intention, telling confidants that America should have never turned control over to the Panamanians, and that the U.S. was being overcharged for using it. But this formal declaration before Congress represented a significant escalation. "We didn't give it to China," Trump continued, his voice rising with conviction. "We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back." In Washington, political analysts immediately began dissecting the implications of this bold declaration. Was this mere rhetorical flourish or the prelude to a significant foreign policy shift? Meanwhile, news outlets scrambled to prepare their headlines about what could potentially become the most contentious U.S.-Latin American dispute of the decade. Little did they know that some 2,000 miles away, in the presidential palace of Panama City, President José Raúl Mulino was watching the broadcast with increasing disbelief, his expression darkening with each word from his American counterpart. "Maria," he called to his chief of staff, who stood nearby, equally stunned by Trump's pronouncement. "Get me the foreign minister. Now." As the warm, humid air of Panama City contrasted with the air-conditioned coolness of the palace, Mulino knew that a diplomatic storm was brewing, one that would test his leadership, his country's sovereignty, and the delicate balance of international relations in the Western Hemisphere. Chapter 2. The Waterway That Changed the World. To understand why Trump's words sent shockwaves through Panama and beyond, one must first understand the Panama Canal's significance, not just as a feat of engineering, but as a symbol laden with historical and political meaning. The story begins over a century ago, when Theodore Roosevelt, buoyed by American expansionist ambitions, set his sights on creating a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The U.S. had just supported Panama's independence from Colombia in 1903. A fortunate coincidence for American interests, as historians would later note with thinly veiled sarcasm. With the ink barely dry on Panama's Declaration of Independence, the Habeas-Navarilla Treaty was signed, granting the United States rights to build and operate the canal within a sovereign, U.S.-controlled canal zone. This 10-mile-wide strip cutting through the heart of Panama would effectively split the young nation in two. Construction began in 1904, and by the time the canal opened in 1914, it stood as one of humanity's greatest engineering achievements. A 50-mile passage featuring a complex system of locks that could raise ships 85 feet above sea level as they traveled between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. It was like watching mountains move, wrote one observer of the first ships traversing the waterway. America had bent nature to its will. For decades, the canal zone operated as a peculiar American enclave, part military base, part company town, with housing, schools, and amenities exclusively for U.S. citizens. Panamanians were excluded unless they worked there, creating what one historian described as a small America inside Panama, complete with white picket fences and suburban dreams. But dreams for some often mean nightmares for others. For Panamanians, the canal zone represented a wound in their national body, a constant reminder of limited sovereignty. As the 20th century progressed, tensions mounted. In January 1964, these tensions erupted when Panamanian students marched to the canal zone border carrying their national flag, demanding it be raised alongside the American flag at Balboa High School. The confrontation spiraled into riots that left 22 Panamanians dead and hundreds injured. This flag incident catalyzed a shift in U.S. policy. By the 1970s, with the canal's economic significance to the U.S. diminishing and Cold War politics evolving, President Jimmy Carter negotiated what many considered unthinkable, returning the canal to Panama. The 1977 Torrijos-Carter treaties created a framework for the gradual transfer of control, with the canal zone dissolved in 1979 and complete Panamanian control scheduled for December 31, 1999. When that day came, celebrations erupted across Panama. It wasn't just a transfer of a waterway, recalled one Panamanian who witnessed the handover ceremony. It was the healing of our national dignity. For the next 25 years, Panama operated the canal with remarkable efficiency, maintaining its neutrality and improving its infrastructure. The waterway became a symbol of Panamanian competence and national pride, a narrative now threatened by Trump's declaration of intent to reclaim what many Panamanians viewed as rightfully theirs. Chapter 3: Mulino's Moment of Truth. President José Raúl Mulino was not a man easily rattled. A seasoned politician with a reputation for measured responses, he had navigated Panama through various diplomatic challenges since taking office. But Trump's congressional speech had caught him off guard, not just for its content, but for its timing. Just hours before, news had broken about a major business deal. BlackRock, the American investment giant, was leading a consortium to purchase a controlling stake in Panama Ports Company from Hong Kong-based C.K. Hutchison Holdings. The $22.8 billion deal involved ports at both ends of the Panama Canal. Mulino had viewed this as a straightforward commercial transaction between private entities, certainly nothing that amounted to the United States reclaiming the canal. Yet somehow, Trump had woven this business deal into a narrative of American reassertion of control. He's trying to take credit for a private business transaction, Mulino muttered to his advisers gathered in his office. And worse, he's presenting it as some kind of government-led operation to take back the canal. The president's foreign policy team exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a young woman who had studied international relations at Georgetown University, spoke up. "Sir, we need to respond forcefully. This isn't just about correcting a mischaracterization, it's about asserting our sovereignty." Mulino nodded, his mind already crafting the words he would use. For months, he had attempted to maintain cordial relations with the Trump administration despite concerning rhetoric. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had visited Panama in February, pressuring Mulino about alleged Chinese influence over the canal, claims Panama had consistently rejected. As a gesture of goodwill, Panama had even chosen not to renew its participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative, a move that had displeased Beijing but was intended to ease Washington's concerns. "And this is how he repays our cooperation," Mulino said, shaking his head. "By claiming to take back what is rightfully ours." The stakes were enormous. The Panama Canal wasn't just infrastructure. It was the backbone of Panama's economy and national identity. Each year, around 15,000 ships transited the waterway, with the Canal Authority generating about $4.3 billion in revenue, funds that benefited the Panamanian people. Moreover, the canal's neutrality was enshrined in the country's constitution, guaranteeing open access to vessels from all nations in times of peace and war. Any suggestion of foreign control, whether Chinese as Trump had previously alleged, or American as he now seemed to be proposing, was anathema to this principle. Mulino walked to the window, gazing out at Panama City's skyline, where modern skyscrapers jutted upward like exclamation points, many built with profits from the canal's successful operation under Panamanian control. "Prepare a statement," he instructed his communications director. "Direct, unambiguous, and dignified. The world needs to hear Panama's voice." The next morning, Mulino's response reverberated across diplomatic channels and social media. Posted on his official X account, the message was blunt. Once again, President Trump is lying. The Panama Canal is not in the process of recovery. He continued, "I reject, on behalf of Panama and all Panamanians, this new affront to the truth and our dignity as a nation." The diplomatic gauntlet had been thrown. Now the world watched to see how Trump would respond. Chapter 4. The Pentagon's Playbook. Far from the tropical heat of Panama, in the air-conditioned corridors of the Pentagon, military planners were already at work. Following Trump's congressional address, the White House had directed the U.S. military to develop options for increasing American presence in Panama, a directive that set defense officials scrambling. Admiral Alvin Halsey, commander of U.S. Southern Command, had been tasked with presenting draft strategies to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. The options ranged from enhanced partnership with Panamanian security forces to the more extreme, and far less likely, scenario of a military operation to seize control of the canal. "This feels like déjà vu," remarked one veteran officer, recalling the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama to remove dictator Manuel Noriega. Except Noriega was a dictator involved in drug trafficking. Mulino is the democratically elected president of a stable ally. The planning sessions were fraught with complexity. The U.S. already maintained a modest military presence in Panama, approximately 200 troops, with some special forces units working with Panamanian forces to protect the country from internal threats. But significantly expanding this presence would require Panama's consent that seemed increasingly unlikely given the escalating diplomatic tensions. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts were assessing Chinese activities around the canal, attempting to substantiate Trump's claims of Beijing's influence. Most concluded that while Chinese companies had legitimate commercial interests in Panama, there was no evidence of the kind of control Trump had alleged. "We're looking for a problem that doesn't exist," one analyst confided to a colleague. "The Panamanian Canal Authority runs the canal. It's independent from the president by constitutional design. Neither China nor anyone else controls it." Nevertheless, plans continued to take shape. Options included securing existing ports, building new American ports, or even using the Army Corps of Engineers to operate the canal's locks, scenarios that ranged from diplomatically challenging to potentially illegal under international law. When these plans leaked to the press, The reaction was swift. The NBC News headline was particularly damning: Trump White House has asked U.S. military to develop options for Panama Canal, officials say. The article detailed how potential plans range from partnering more closely with Panamanian security forces to a less likely option of U.S. troops seizing the canal by force. It further noted that the use of military force would be considered only if closer partnership with Panama failed to achieve Trump's goal of reclaiming the waterway. In Panama City, the leak only heightened anxiety. Protesters gathered outside the U.S. Embassy, waving Panamanian flags and holding signs that read, "Hands off our canal," and 1903 will not happen again, the latter referring to the original U.S. acquisition of the canal zone. The diplomatic chess game was growing more complex by the day, with each side's moves narrowing the options for peaceful resolution. Chapter 5. The Chinese Whispers. While the U.S. and Panama exchanged increasingly heated diplomatic salvos, China watched from the sidelines with a mixture of concern and strategic calculation. For years, Beijing had been steadily expanding its economic footprint in Latin America, with trade, infrastructure investments, and diplomatic initiatives. Panama had been part of this strategy, joining China's Belt and Road Initiative after cutting diplomatic ties with Taiwan in 2017. The Panama Canal represented a critical juncture in global shipping, including for Chinese goods bound for the eastern United States and Europe. Any disruption to its neutral operation would have significant implications for Beijing's trade networks. In response to Trump's allegations, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian had issued a carefully worded statement. China supports Panama's sovereignty over the canal and is committed to maintaining its status as a permanently neutral international waterway. China has never been involved in the management or operation of the canal, nor has it interfered in its affairs. But privately, Chinese officials were growing increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as American pressure tactics. When Panama had announced it would not renew its participation in the Belt and Road Initiative, a decision clearly influenced by U.S. pressure, Beijing had made its disappointment crystal clear. The U.S. is acting with a Cold War mindset, one Chinese diplomat had told his Panamanian counterpart. They see ghosts where there are none. Now, with Trump's reclaiming rhetoric and the revelation of Pentagon planning, China saw an opportunity to position itself as the defender of Panamanian sovereignty against American imperialism, a narrative that resonated with many across Latin America. In a calculated move, China's ambassador to Panama hosted a cultural exchange event celebrating Panamanian independence, during which he pointedly remarked, "China respects the sovereignty of all nations, regardless of their size. We believe the Panama Canal, like the South China Sea, should remain free from external interference." The irony of the South China Sea reference wasn't lost on diplomatic observers, but the message landed effectively in Panamanian media. Meanwhile, Chinese state media outlets began publishing historical analyses of U.S. interventions in Latin America, with particular focus on the 1903 engineering of Panamanian independence and subsequent U.S. control of the Canal Zone. One popular piece was titled, "From the Monroe Doctrine to the Trump Doctrine: 2 Centuries of American Imperialism." For Panama, caught between these two global powers, the situation was growing increasingly uncomfortable. President Mulino had to maintain sovereignty while avoiding being pulled too deeply into either American or Chinese orbits, a delicate balancing act made more difficult by Trump's provocative stance. "We are not pawns in a great power game," Mulino told his cabinet during an emergency meeting. "We are a sovereign nation that has successfully operated the canal for 25 years. Our policy must reflect that reality." As if to underscore this point, Mulino arranged a very public tour of the Miraflores locks, where he spent time chatting with Panamanian canal workers and engineers. Images of the president wearing a yellow hard hat alongside ordinary Panamanians were broadcast nationally and internationally, a visual statement of Panama's ownership and competent management of the waterway. The message was clear: Regardless of what either Washington or Beijing might desire, the canal belonged to Panama. Chapter 6. The BlackRock Connection. Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, hadn't expected to find himself at the center of a geopolitical confrontation. As head of the world's largest asset management firm, he was accustomed to navigating complex business environments, but the political implications of his company's latest deal had taken an unusual turn. BlackRock was leading a consortium that included the Geneva-based Mediterranean Shipping Company in a $22.8 billion transaction to acquire C.K. Hutchison's port operations, including a 90% stake in Panama Ports Company, which operated the Balboa and Cristobal ports at opposite ends of the Panama Canal. The deal had been in development for months, involving complex financial negotiations, regulatory considerations, and strategic planning standard procedure for a transaction of this magnitude. What wasn't standard was having the President of the United States frame it as part of an American government operation to reclaim the Panama Canal. "This is purely a commercial transaction," Fink insisted during a hastily arranged CNBC interview. "BlackRock sees long-term value in these assets. This has nothing to do with U.S. government policy or geopolitical maneuvering." But context mattered. The deal had emerged during a period of heightened U.S. concern about Chinese influence in the region. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had made Panama his first foreign destination, warning about Chinese presence near the canal. Trump had repeatedly claimed, without evidence, that China controlled the waterway. For C.K. Hutchison, a conglomerate founded by Hong Kong billionaire Li Ka-shing, the timing was particularly awkward. Frank Sixt, the company's co-managing director, had explicitly stated, "I would like to stress that the transaction is purely commercial in nature and wholly unrelated to recent political news reports concerning the Panama ports." Yet perception often outweighs reality in international relations. Despite these corporate disavowals, many observers couldn't help but see the transaction through a geopolitical lens of view reinforced by Trump's congressional address. The situation highlighted a growing phenomenon in the global economy. Private business decisions increasingly intersected with national security concerns and great power competition. Companies like BlackRock found themselves navigating not just market conditions but geopolitical currents as well. For Panama, the transaction raised complex questions. While the government maintained that it was a private business matter requiring regulatory approval, it couldn't ignore the political dimensions. Would approving the deal appear as capitulation to U.S. pressure? Would rejecting it unnecessarily antagonize Washington? President Mulino addressed these concerns during a press conference in Panama City. "Let me be absolutely clear," he stated firmly. "The Panama Ports Company operates container terminals. It does not operate the Panama Canal. The canal is managed by the Panama Canal Authority, an autonomous government entity whose independence is guaranteed by our Constitution." He continued, "Any transaction involving the ports will be evaluated according to Panamanian law and national interest, not according to the wishes of any foreign power, be it the United States, China, or any other nation." Behind closed doors, Panamanian officials were conducting a thorough review of the proposed transaction, examining not just its financial aspects but its implications for national sovereignty and economic security. The BlackRock deal had become a test case for Panama's ability to assert independence in its decision-making. Meanwhile, in New York, BlackRock executives were walking a tightrope trying to complete a profitable business transaction while avoiding becoming entangled in a diplomatic dispute between two nations. As one executive remarked privately, "We're in the business of managing assets, not international relations. How did we end up in the middle of this?" Chapter 7. Latin American Ripples. The Trump-Mulino dispute over the Panama Canal quickly transcended bilateral relations, sending ripples throughout Latin America. Regional leaders found themselves forced to take positions or strategically avoid doing so on an issue that touched on fundamental questions of sovereignty, great power influence, and the legacy of U.S. interventionism in the hemisphere. In Argentina, President Javier Milei, a self-proclaimed admirer of Trump, broke ranks with most regional leaders by declaring his unequivocal support for the Panama Canal being delivered to Trump. This stance, while consistent with Milei's pro-U.S. foreign policy, put him at odds with the majority of Latin American opinion. Milei's position became starkly evident when he reportedly was the only country official to reject a Community of Latin American and Caribbean States resolution supporting Mulino, a move that isolated Argentina from its neighbors but endeared Milei to Trump. By contrast, Colombian President Gustavo Petro and Chilean President Gabriel Boric quickly positioned themselves as defenders of Panamanian sovereignty. Petro, whose country shares a border with Panama, was particularly vocal. Today it's the Panama Canal, tomorrow it could be Colombian resources, Petro warned during a speech in Bogotá. We stand firmly with our Panamanian brothers and sisters in defense of their sovereign rights. Boric, the young leftist Chilean leader, dismissed Trump's statements as bravado, but cautioned that they reflected a concerning perspective on Latin American sovereignty. Given Chile's status as a maritime nation heavily dependent on international shipping, its interest in keeping the canal neutral and efficiently operated was obvious. Peru found itself in a particularly delicate position. The country had recently inaugurated the Chancay megaport, a joint venture between the Chinese state-owned shipping company COSCO and the Peruvian mining company Volcan. With significant Chinese investment in its infrastructure, Peru had to balance economic realities with regional solidarity. We support international law and the sovereignty of nations, Peru's foreign minister stated carefully, avoiding direct criticism of either the U.S. or China. Mexico, under leftist President Claudia Sheinbaum, took a more forthright stance. The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over, she declared during a press conference. Latin American nations are not protectorates. They are sovereign states with the right to determine their own affairs. Brazil, the region's largest economy, adopted a moderate position reflective of its ambitions as a global player. President Lula da Silva called for dialogue and respect for international law, while offering to mediate between Panama and the United States if requested. For smaller Central American nations, the situation was especially fraught. Many had significant economic ties to both the United States and China, and the last thing they wanted was to be forced to choose sides in a great power competition playing out in their neighborhood. Costa Rica's president captured this sentiment during a regional forum. Central America has too often been treated as a chessboard for great power games. We need cooperation, not competition, respect, not rhetoric. The Organization of American States convened an emergency session to discuss the situation, resulting in a carefully worded statement affirming the importance of respecting the sovereignty of member states and the inviolability of treaties, language that supported Panama without directly condemning the United States. Throughout these diplomatic maneuvers, President Mulino worked the phones, building a coalition of support among his Latin American counterparts. He understood that Panama's position was strongest when embedded within a broader regional consensus affirming the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention. What happens with the Panama Canal is not just a Panamanian issue, he told a gathering of Latin American ambassadors in Panama City. It is a test of whether our region will be treated with the respect it deserves in the 21st century. As Latin American nations aligned themselves in this diplomatic chess game, the underlying message became clear. The days when the United States could unilaterally dictate terms in what it once called its backyard were over. Whether Trump would acknowledge this new reality remained to be seen. Chapter 8: The Media Battlefield. As the diplomatic crisis unfolded, another battle raged across television screens, newspaper pages, and social media platforms. The narrative war over the Panama Canal situation proved nearly as consequential as the official exchanges between governments. Fox News anchors framed the story as one of American reassertion after decades of decline. The United States built that canal with American ingenuity and American dollars, declared one prominent host. President Trump is simply reclaiming what is rightfully ours from Chinese influence. By contrast, CNN featured interviews with international law experts who emphasized the binding nature of the Torrijos-Carter treaties and Panama's clear legal sovereignty over the canal. "This isn't a question of opinion," explained one Yale professor. "The treaties were ratified by the U.S. Senate. The transfer of control was legal and complete." MSNBC hosts highlighted what they characterized as the neo-colonial undertones of Trump's position, with one commentator noting, "There's something profoundly disturbing about a U.S. president talking about taking back territory from a sovereign Latin American nation in 2025. In Panama, newspapers across the political spectrum united in defense of national sovereignty. La Prensa, typically conservative, ran the headline "Our Canal, Our Sovereignty," alongside an editorial calling for national unity in the face of external pressure. The more liberal La Estrella featured historical analyses of Panama's long struggle for control of the canal. Social media amplified these divergent narratives, with hashtags like Hands Off Panama and Take Back the Canal trending globally. Memes proliferated, some mocking Trump's apparent ignorance of the treaties, others celebrating Panama's successful management of the waterway since taking control in 1999. YouTube creators produced rapid response videos explaining the history of the canal and the legal framework governing its operation. One particularly viral video by a Panamanian engineer walked viewers through how the canal's lock system worked, emphasizing the technical expertise of the Panamanian workforce that kept this engineering marvel functioning smoothly. Chinese state media outlets like CGTN and the Global Times presented the situation as evidence of American imperialism, contrasting U.S. aggression with China's win-win cooperation approach to Latin America. These narratives found receptive audiences in countries with historical grievances against U.S. intervention. The clash of narratives created a challenging environment for citizens trying to understand the complex situation. Facts became entangled with opinion, history with propaganda, legitimate concerns with paranoid speculation. President Mulino recognized the importance of this media battlefield. His communications team worked diligently to ensure Panama's perspective reached international audiences, arranging interviews with major global news outlets and producing informational content about the canal's operation and economic significance. "We need to win the narrative war," Mulino told his media advisors. "Not with rhetoric or exaggeration, but with facts, history, and the simple truth of our sovereignty." The Panamanian government launched a digital campaign titled Panama Canal, 25 Years of Excellence, highlighting the waterway's successful operation under Panamanian control. The campaign included statistics on increased efficiency, expanded capacity through the addition of a third set of locks completed in 2016, and the billions of dollars in revenue generated for Panama's development. Meanwhile, a different kind of media narrative was emerging from the Pentagon leak about military options. Images of the 1989 U.S. invasion of Panama resurfaced, showing American troops in the streets of Panama City, visual reminders of what military intervention had looked like in living memory. These images proved particularly powerful in Latin America, where the long history of U.S. military interventions remained a sensitive topic. They served as a stark counterpoint to the Trump administration's claims of merely wanting to protect American interests. As the media battle intensified, both sides recognized that public opinion in Panama, the United States, and globally would play a crucial role in determining the eventual resolution of this diplomatic crisis. The narrative that prevailed might well shape the policy options available to both Trump and Mulino. Chapter 9. Economic Calculations. Beyond the rhetoric and diplomatic posturing lay hard economic realities that both sides had to consider as the canal dispute escalated. The Panama Canal remained a vital artery of global trade, handling approximately 5% of world maritime commerce. For Panama, it represented much more than a symbol of sovereignty. It was the cornerstone of the national economy, generating billions in annual revenue and supporting tens of thousands of jobs. The canal's economic impact study had shown that the waterway contributed about 40% of Panama's GDP when including all related economic activities. Any disruption to its operation or international status would have devastating consequences for the country's economy. For the United States, the canal's significance had evolved over time. While historically crucial for military mobility between the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, its contemporary importance was primarily commercial. Nearly 40% of all container traffic through the canal originated from or was destined for U.S. ports. American shippers saved billions annually by using the canal instead of the longer route around South America. Major retailers like Walmart and Amazon depended on the efficient flow of goods through the waterway to maintain their supply chains. Any disruption, whether from political tensions or actual changes in operation, would ripple through the U.S. economy in the form of higher prices and delivery delays. Economic analysts on Wall Street were already gaming out scenarios. Panama Canal risk assessment reports began appearing from major investment banks, examining everything from shipping delays to insurance premium increases. One J.P. Morgan analysis suggested that extended uncertainty around the canal could add $1.2 billion to U.S. consumer costs annually through higher shipping rates alone. The situation created unusual alliances. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, not typically at odds with Republican administrations, issued a carefully worded statement emphasizing the importance of stable, predictable conditions for international commerce, and noting that the reliable operation of the Panama Canal under its current governance has served American business interests well. Similarly, American agricultural exporters, many from states that had voted heavily for Trump, expressed concern about potential disruptions. The canal was a crucial conduit for shipping grain from the Midwest to Asian markets, and farmers were already dealing with enough uncertainties from weather and market fluctuations without adding geopolitical tensions to the mix. "We just want to sell our soybeans to China without getting caught in the crossfire," remarked the head of an Iowa agricultural cooperative in a widely quoted Farm Journal interview. Panama, meanwhile, was calculating the potential economic costs of standing firm against U.S. pressure. While the canal itself was protected by international treaties and global economic interests, other aspects of Panama's economy were more vulnerable to American influence. The United States remained Panama's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade exceeding $7 billion annually. American tourists contributed significantly to Panama's service sector, and U.S. companies had substantial investments throughout the Panamanian economy. Additionally, Panama's banking system, a crucial part of its economy, relied heavily on relationships with American financial institutions. President Mulino received daily briefings on these economic dimensions from his finance and commerce ministers. "We must be principled but not reckless," he told them during one such meeting. "What are our economic pressure points, and how can we mitigate potential impacts?" Their assessment was sobering but not catastrophic. Panama had diversified its economic relationships over the past 2 decades, with growing ties to Europe, Asia, and other Latin American countries. While American economic pressure would hurt, it wouldn't be fatal, especially if Panama maintained international support for its position. The wild card in these economic calculations was China. As America's primary geopolitical rival and the world's second-largest economy, China had both the motivation and the means to provide economic support to Panama if U.S.-Panamanian relations deteriorated further. Yet Mulino was wary of becoming too dependent on Chinese support, recognizing that exchanging one form of external influence for another would not serve Panama's long-term interests. His economic team was instructed to prepare contingency plans that maximized Panama's independence rather than simply shifting dependencies. As economists and business leaders on both sides ran their calculations, one conclusion became increasingly clear: a prolonged dispute over the canal would produce no economic winners. The interdependence of the global economy meant that disruptions to such a crucial trade artery would impose costs on all parties, a reality that offered at least some incentive for eventual compromise. Chapter 10. The Diplomatic Dance. 2 months into the crisis, with tensions still high but the immediate shock of Trump's reclaiming declaration having somewhat subsided, the contours of a potential diplomatic resolution began to emerge. Behind the scenes, career diplomats from both countries had maintained channels of communication even as their political leaders exchanged barbs in public. These professional Foreign Service officers understood that beyond the heated rhetoric lay genuine interests that needed to be addressed. From the American side, legitimate concerns about security and access needed acknowledgement, even if Trump's framing and methods were problematic. From Panama's perspective, sovereignty was non-negotiable, but there was room for discussion on enhanced cooperation that respected that sovereignty. The first breakthrough came through an unlikely intermediary: Canada. As a nation with strong ties to both the United States and Panama but without the baggage of historical interventionism in Latin America, Canada offered its good offices to facilitate dialogue. Canadian Foreign Minister Alexandra Mills shuttled between Washington and Panama City, carrying messages and exploring potential compromises. "My job isn't to judge either side's position," she told reporters during a brief statement in Ottawa. "It's to help two important partners find common ground." These quiet diplomatic efforts received unexpected support from an influential voice in U.S. politics: former President Jimmy Carter. Though frail at 100 years old, Carter issued a statement through his foundation reminding all parties of the careful balance struck in the treaties bearing his name. The Torrijos-Carter treaties were designed to respect Panama's sovereignty while ensuring that the canal remained secure and accessible to global commerce, the statement read. They represent a model of how nations can resolve complex issues through mutual respect and good faith negotiation. The involvement of Carter, whose negotiation of the original treaties had once been criticized by Trump, added a significant historical dimension to the diplomatic discussions. It reminded all parties that the current legal framework hadn't emerged from weakness but from principled negotiation beneficial to both countries. Within the Trump administration, pragmatic voices began to gain traction. Secretary of Commerce Elizabeth Cheney, concerned about the economic implications of prolonged tension, advocated for a solution that would address security concerns without undermining the treaty framework. Even Defense Secretary Hegseth, initially seen as a hawk on the issue, acknowledged privately that military options carried unacceptable risks and costs. In Panama, President Mulino faced his own domestic pressures. While Panamanians universally supported defending sovereignty over the canal, opinions differed on how confrontational to be with the United States. Opposition leaders urged Mulino to take a more conciliatory approach, while nationalist factions demanded even stronger resistance to perceived American bullying. Navigating these crosscurrents, Mulino maintained a consistent position. Panama was open to dialogue but would not compromise on sovereignty. "We can discuss cooperation," he stated during a national address. "We cannot and will not discuss control." The diplomatic breakthrough, when it finally came, was framed not as a concession by either side but as an enhancement of existing arrangements. After weeks of behind-the-scenes negotiation, the two countries announced the formation of a US Panama Canal Security and Prosperity Partnership, a framework that would increase cooperation while explicitly affirming Panama's sovereignty over the waterway. Key elements of the partnership included: 1. Enhanced information sharing between Panamanian canal authorities and U.S. security agencies regarding potential threats. 2. Joint training exercises between Panamanian and U.S. forces focused on protecting the canal from terrorism or sabotage. 3. American technical assistance for canal maintenance and expansion projects. 4. Confirmation that canal tolls would continue to be set solely by the Panama Canal Authority, with a joint economic committee to review their impact on global trade. 5. A clear reaffirmation of existing treaty obligations, including Panama's sovereignty and the canal's neutrality. To save face, the Trump administration characterized the agreement as strengthening America's position regarding the canal, pointing particularly to the security cooperation elements. Trump himself tweeted, "Just negotiated the strongest canal security deal ever. America's interests protected. Great relationship with Panama." For his part, Mulino emphasized that the agreement fully preserved Panama's sovereignty while enhancing cooperation with an important partner. This partnership demonstrates that respect for sovereignty and mutually beneficial cooperation are not contradictory but complementary, he stated at the signing ceremony in Panama City. International reaction was largely positive. The United Nations Secretary-General praised both countries for resolving tensions through diplomatic means. Latin American leaders generally expressed relief, though some noted that the crisis should never have occurred in the first place. As for China, its foreign ministry issued a measured statement, noting the agreement and reiterating Beijing's support for Panama's sovereignty. Behind the diplomatic language lay a recognition that China had neither gained nor lost significant ground in the region through the episode. The resolution wasn't perfect, and tensions remained beneath the surface. But for the moment, at least, the Panama Canal, that engineering marvel connecting oceans and continents, would continue its operations not as a flashpoint for conflict but as what its builders had originally intended, a pathway connecting nations and facilitating the peaceful flow of global commerce. Epilogue. Lessons from the Canal. As the dust settled on the Panama Canal dispute of 2025, observers and participants alike reflected on its significance and the lessons it offered for international relations in an increasingly multipolar world. For Panama, the crisis had been a test of national resolve and diplomatic skill. By standing firm on sovereignty while remaining open to reasonable cooperation, the small Central American nation had demonstrated that even countries with limited power could effectively defend their interests when they held the moral and legal high ground. "This was Panama's diplomatic coming of age," remarked a former Panamanian ambassador. "We showed the world that we can manage not only our canal but also our foreign relations with sophistication and principle." Within the United States, reactions were mixed. Foreign policy experts largely viewed the episode as an unnecessary crisis that had strained relations with a traditional ally and damaged American credibility in Latin America. One former State Department official described it as a textbook case of how not to conduct foreign policy, creating a problem where none existed, then having to find a face-saving way out. Trump supporters, however, saw the outcome differently. They pointed to increased security cooperation as evidence that the president's forceful approach had yielded positive results. "Sometimes you have to shake things up to make progress," argued one conservative commentator. "The president put American interests first, and we got a better deal." For China, the crisis had been both a challenge and an opportunity. Beijing had lost some ground when Panama withdrew from the Belt and Road Initiative under American pressure, but had gained sympathy in parts of Latin America by positioning itself as a defender of regional sovereignty against perceived U.S. bullying. "The Americans gave us a gift," one Chinese diplomat reportedly told a colleague. They reminded Latin America why many countries have been looking for alternative partnerships in the first place. The business community drew its own conclusions. BlackRock's acquisition of Panama Ports Company eventually proceeded after receiving regulatory approval from the Panamanian government, but not before additional conditions were added to ensure transparency and respect for national interests. The episode served as a reminder that in an era of great power competition, even seemingly straightforward commercial transactions could become entangled in geopolitics. For global shipping interests, the resolution brought welcome relief. The Switzerland-based International Chamber of Shipping issued a statement expressing appreciation for the diplomatic efforts that have preserved the canal's neutral operation, adding that predictability and stability in global maritime choke points benefit all nations. Perhaps the most significant lesson, though, was about the changing nature of power in the 21st century. The Panama Canal dispute had demonstrated that traditional military and economic might, while still important, had to contend with other forms of influence. Legal frameworks, international opinion, media narratives, and the moral authority that comes from respecting sovereignty and self-determination. The days when a great power could simply impose its will on smaller nations through threats or force are fading, wrote a prominent international relations scholar. Even the most powerful countries now operate in a world where legitimacy matters, reputation has economic value, and smaller nations have more options for building coalitions and resistance. This wasn't to say that power imbalances had disappeared, far from it. But the channels through which power flowed had become more complex, creating spaces where skillful diplomatic maneuvering could sometimes offset raw strength. 6 months after the crisis peaked, President Mulino made a state visit to Washington. The formal reception at the White House featured warm words about friendship and partnership, with the recent tensions diplomatically omitted from official remarks. Yet during a private moment in the Oval Office, away from the cameras and microphones, Trump reportedly asked Mulino a question that revealed much about his worldview. "So, Jose, between us, wouldn't Panama be better off if we still ran the canal?" Mulino, maintaining his diplomatic composure, smiled politely before responding, "Mr. President, would America be better off if Great Britain still ran your country?" Trump laughed heartily, slapping Mulino on the back. Whether the message had truly registered remained unclear. Meanwhile, at the Miraflores locks in Panama, tourists from around the world continued to gather on observation decks, watching in amazement as massive container ships were raised and lowered with precision by Panamanian operators. Most visitors were oblivious to the diplomatic drama that had recently surrounded this engineering marvel. A young Panamanian guide, explaining the canal's operation to a group of American tourists, concluded her presentation with words that captured the waterway's enduring significance. "The canal connects not just two oceans, but also our past and future. It was built by American hands, but is now operated by Panamanian ones, a reminder that history moves forward, not backward, and that progress comes when nations respect each other's right to self-determination." As the massive lock gates opened and another ship began its journey between oceans, the guide's words hung in the humid air, a simple truth that had nearly been forgotten in the heat of diplomatic confrontation. The Panama Canal, like the nations it served, would continue to evolve, adapting to new realities while maintaining its essential purpose of connecting a complex and interdependent world. Bonus chapter: The View from Main Street. Away from the corridors of power in Washington and Panama City, ordinary citizens in both countries experienced the canal dispute through very different lenses, demonstrating how geopolitical tensions often manifest in unexpected ways in everyday life. In Colón, Panama, near the Atlantic entrance to the canal, schoolteacher Mariana Espinosa found herself suddenly thrust into the role of impromptu historian. Her fifth-grade students arrived at school bubbling with questions after hearing their parents discussing Trump's comments. "Miss, is America going to take our canal?" one wide-eyed 10-year-old asked during morning circle time. Rather than dismissing their concerns, Mariana recognized a teaching opportunity. She pulled out old textbooks showing photographs from the 1977 treaty signing and the 1999 handover ceremony. Together, the class created a timeline of the canal's history that they proudly displayed in the school hallway. "I wanted them to understand that this wasn't just about politics but about our identity as Panamanians," she explained later. "The canal represents our journey as a nation from colonization to sovereignty." Across Panama, similar conversations were taking place in homes, workplaces, and social gatherings. Canal employees, in particular, felt a personal stake in the dispute. Many came from families with 2 or 3 generations of canal workers, creating a deep institutional pride. Miguel Barrios, a third-generation lock operator whose grandfather had worked under American administration and whose father had been part of the transition to Panamanian control, expressed this sentiment during his lunch break at the Gatun locks. "My abuelo taught my father, who taught me," he said, gesturing toward the massive lock gates. "We've proven that Panamanians can run this canal better than anyone. Our safety record, our efficiency metrics, they all improved under our management. So when I hear someone suggest we can't handle it..." He shook his head, leaving the sentence unfinished. Meanwhile, in Omaha, Nebraska, about as far from any ocean as one can get in North America, Midwestern farmers were experiencing the canal dispute through the lens of grain prices and export markets. At the corner cafe, where local farmers gathered each morning for coffee, conversation regularly turned to the potential impact on shipping costs. Nebraska corn and soybeans typically traveled down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, then through the Panama Canal to Asian markets. First it was tariffs, then it was pandemic supply chains, now it's this canal business, grumbled Tom Erickson, a third-generation corn farmer, as he stirred cream into his coffee. "Sometimes I think Washington forgets that when they play these international games, it's our bottom lines that take the hit." His friend Dave Peterson, who farmed 2,000 acres of soybeans, nodded in agreement. "I voted for Trump twice, and I like that he stands up for America. But I wish he'd consulted with some of us before rattling sabers about the canal. Those shipping routes matter to our exports." In Florida's tourism industry, the canal dispute created unexpected ripples as Panamanian tour operators reported a noticeable decline in American bookings. Maria Gonzalez, who ran eco-tours in Panama's rainforests, found herself fielding uncomfortable questions from potential U.S. customers. "They email asking if it's safe to visit Panama right now, as if we're in some kind of conflict zone," she said with frustration. "I have to explain that despite what they might see on cable news, Americans are still welcome here. This is a diplomatic disagreement, not a war." Even American schoolchildren found themselves engaging with the issue. In Ms. Rodriguez's high school Spanish class in Phoenix, Arizona, students practiced their language skills by translating and discussing Panamanian newspaper articles about the dispute. "I wanted them to see beyond the American media perspective," Ms. Rodriguez explained. "Reading how Panamanians themselves viewed the situation gave my students insights into different cultural and historical perspectives." One of her students, 17-year-old Jason Williams, admitted the exercise had changed his thinking. "Before, I just knew the canal as something in our history books. I didn't realize it's still such a big deal to Panamanians today and represents their independence." Perhaps the most unique perspective came from those who straddled both worlds. Carmen Diaz, a Panamanian-American business consultant living in Miami, found herself serving as an unofficial cultural interpreter within her professional network. "My American colleagues would ask me to explain what Panama really wants, while my family in Panama wanted to know if Americans really supported taking back the canal," she recalled. "I kept telling both sides that the average person in each country respects the other, it's just that politics and historical baggage complicate things." These everyday experiences highlighted how international disputes, often framed in abstract geopolitical terms, ultimately touch real lives in concrete ways, from shipping costs and tourism bookings to classroom discussions and family conversations. They also revealed something profound about the interconnected nature of the modern world. A statement made in Washington could affect grain prices in Nebraska, tourism bookings in Panama City, and classroom discussions in Arizona, an intricate web of cause and effect that no individual leader could fully control or predict. As Panama and the United States navigated their diplomatic tensions, these human connections, economic, cultural, and personal formed an underlying fabric of relationships that helped sustain the bilateral bond even during political disagreements. In that sense, the Panama Canal continued to fulfill its original purpose, connecting not just oceans, but people and nations, in ways that transcended the political moment. The final chapter: Echoes and Reflections. 1 year after the Panama Canal crisis reached its peak, its echoes continued to reverberate through international relations, leaving lasting marks on institutions, policies, and perceptions. On a warm April morning in 2026, President José Raúl Mulino stood at a podium set up beside the Panama Canal Administration Building, addressing an audience gathered to commemorate the canal's 112th anniversary. Behind him stretched the impressive waterway that had nearly become a flashpoint for international conflict. 1 year ago, our sovereignty was questioned, Mulino began, his voice steady and reflective. Today, we can say with pride that Panama not only defended its rights but emerged stronger from that challenge. The previous year's crisis had indeed strengthened Panama in unexpected ways. The necessity of articulating and defending its position had led to greater institutional coherence within the government. The Panama Canal Authority had implemented transparency reforms that further insulated its operations from political interference, whether domestic or foreign. And Panama's diplomatic corps had gained valuable experience in coalition building and strategic communication. Most significantly, Panama had diversified its international relationships. While maintaining cordial relations with both the United States and China, Mulino's government had strengthened ties with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and fellow Latin American nations, reducing dependency on any single great power. The lesson we learned, Mulino told the assembled dignitaries, is that in today's world, a nation's security comes not from alignment with one power or another, but from building a network of relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests. In Washington, the canal dispute had prompted a broader reassessment of U.S. approach to Latin America. A bipartisan congressional delegation had recently completed a tour of the region, returning with recommendations for a more partnership-oriented strategy that respected sovereignty while addressing shared challenges like migration, climate change, and organized crime. The days of seeing Latin America primarily through a Cold War or anti-China lens need to end, concluded their report. Our hemisphere faces common challenges that require genuine collaboration, not confrontation or condescension. Even within the Trump administration, certain adjustments had occurred. Secretary of State Rubio, who had initially taken a hard line on the canal issue, had moderated his approach after seeing the negative regional reaction. His more recent diplomatic initiatives emphasized economic cooperation and shared democratic values rather than security competition with China. The private sector had also drawn lessons from the episode. International investors now conducted more thorough political risk assessments for infrastructure projects in strategic locations, recognizing that commercial considerations could not be fully separated from geopolitical ones. BlackRock had created a dedicated geopolitical risk unit to evaluate how great power competition might affect future investments. We live in a world where business and geopolitics are increasingly intertwined, Larry Fink explained during a Davos panel. The Panama Ports acquisition taught us that even the most straightforward commercial transaction can become complicated when it intersects with national interests and historical sensitivities. For everyday Panamanians, the crisis had reinforced national pride in the canal and their management of it. Canal-themed merchandise had become increasingly popular, with T-shirts bearing slogans like Panama Canal, locally owned and operated since 1999, appearing in tourist shops throughout Panama City. Tourism had actually increased, with visitors curious to see the canal that had featured so prominently in international news. Tour guides had added segments about the 2025 diplomatic standoff to their presentations, usually concluding with a touch of humor about how calm the actual canal remained throughout the political turbulence. As for the canal itself, It continued operating with the steady efficiency that had characterized its management under Panamanian control. Ship transits had increased by 3% over the previous year, and a new infrastructure investment plan had been announced to ensure the waterway remained competitive amid evolving global shipping patterns. The political tensions had left one lasting mark on canal operations. However, cybersecurity had been dramatically enhanced after security experts identified multiple attempted intrusions during the height of the crisis. Whether these were state-sponsored or opportunistic remained unclear, but they had prompted a comprehensive overhaul of the canal's digital infrastructure. In his office overlooking the canal, Panama Canal Authority Administrator Ricord Vasquez reflected on this digital dimension as he prepared for an international maritime conference. In 1914, canal security meant gunboats and fortifications, he mused. Today, it means firewalls and encryption. But the principle remains the same, ensuring this vital global artery remains open and neutral. By early 2026, the canal dispute had begun to fade from international headlines, becoming another chapter in the complex history of US-Panama relations rather than an active crisis. Both countries had moved on to other priorities, from elections to economic challenges to emerging crises elsewhere in the world. Yet the episode had revealed something important about the evolving international order, something neither Trump nor Mulino had fully appreciated when their confrontation began. In a world where power was more diffuse, legitimacy more contested, and interdependence more extensive, even the most powerful nations could not simply impose their will. And even the smallest nations were not without resources when defending principles enshrined in international law. The Panama Canal, that remarkable feat of engineering that had connected oceans and transformed global shipping, had once again served as a mirror reflecting changes in the wider world. Just as its construction had symbolized the emergence of the United States as a global power in the early 20th century, the 2025 dispute over its control had illuminated the more complex power dynamics of the early 21st. As Mulino concluded his anniversary address, he gestured toward the canal where a massive container ship was making its way through the Miraflores locks. "This waterway will always be more than just infrastructure," he said. "It is a symbol of how humanity at its best can overcome natural barriers through cooperation and ingenuity. May it continue to connect not just oceans, but peoples and nations, for generations to come." The assembled crowd applauded as the ship continued its journey, a journey made possible by American vision, Panamanian sovereignty, and the global cooperation that, despite occasional tensions, remained the foundation of the international order. In that sense, the Panama Canal had once again fulfilled its deepest purpose, bringing the world a little closer together, one ship at a time. Key vocabulary, repeated throughout. Diplomatic terms. Sovereignty, the authority of a state to govern itself. Treaty, a formally concluded agreement between states. Bilateral relations, official relations between two countries. Foreign policy, a government strategy in dealing with other nations. Diplomatic crisis, a situation of high tension between countries. Negotiations, discussions aimed at reaching an agreement. International law, rules that govern relations between nations. Mediation, intervention in a dispute to resolve it. Panama Canal specific. Locks, enclosures with gates that raise and lower ships. Canal zone, the former U.S.-controlled territory surrounding the canal. Panama Canal Authority, autonomous agency managing the canal. Torrijos-Carter Treaties, 1977 agreements returning the canal to Panama. Transit, passage through the canal. Tolls, fees paid by ships to use the canal. Waterway, a route for travel by water. Miraflores locks, one of the major lock systems in the canal. Political concepts. Monroe Doctrine, historical U.S. policy opposing European intervention in the Americas. Belt and Road Initiative, China's global infrastructure development strategy. Imperialism, policy of extending a country's power through colonization or control. Neutrality, the state of not supporting either side in a conflict. Geopolitics, politics as influenced by geographical factors. Self-determination, the process of a country determining its own statehood. Great power competition, rivalry between major world powers. National security, protection of a nation from threats. Economic terms. Global trade, commercial transactions between countries. Supply chain, network between a company and its suppliers. Infrastructure, basic physical structures needed for operation of a society. Investment, allocation of resources with expectation of generating profit. Commercial transaction, business dealings involving buying and selling. Consortium, association of companies for joint venture. Economic security, condition of having stable income or resources. Regulatory approval, official permission after review by authorities. That was The Panama Canal Chess Game, A Tale of Two Leaders, brought to you by Story-Driven English. If you enjoyed this diplomatic drama that took you behind the scenes of international politics while learning valuable English vocabulary and expressions, please don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who are learning English, and leave a comment below telling us which part of the story you found most interesting. Did you notice how many diplomatic and political terms were naturally woven throughout the narrative? Learning English through engaging stories helps you absorb vocabulary and context, making it easier to remember and use in your own conversations. Subscribe to Story-Driven English for more immersive stories that will expand your English vocabulary while entertaining you with compelling narratives. Our stories cover history, science, business, and more, all designed to improve your language skills while you enjoy the journey. Until our next story adventure, keep practicing your English and remember, every word you learn opens a new door to understanding the world.